Okay, so you've made your apple mold, and now we're going to start the process of casting into it. This material, just so you know, is a waste mold material. Plaster bandage is, it was used for making bandages, and so it's not a permanent material. It's a casting material that's really pretty easy to work with. It can do a lot. It's fairly inexpensive and pretty easy to kind of make molds with. But we have to kind of like cast and prep each material in a different way, and there's kind of a sequence that we're going to go through of casting. For this class, we're going to produce a casting with in latex rubber, and then after we make that casting, you're going to produce a casting with plaster. Okay. But you could, this is a casting of an apple in, and I'm sorry, my lighting I'm kind of in the way here. This is a casting of an apple in paper, which you could also kind of experiment with. And this is a casting that is in silicone rubber. That is something you can do. Do not use your silicone rubber. So you have silicone rubber in your kit, which is called Dragon Skin. It's a very, very nice silicone rubber. This has been like tinted a little bit, but don't use it to cast into your apple. We need that for our molds, okay? Then there's also a material that is called mannequin rubber or rigid latex, which is the same thing as this latex, which is soft and rubbery like a balloon, but it is rigid. So that is what they used to make mannequins out of. Also, there's a different prep technique used for this. This is soft foam, like a Nerf football. It's a urethane two-part resin system that you could cast into a plaster bandage. So these are all things you could cast into the plaster bandage mold, but for our class, I'm going to be requiring that you do a latex rubber casting and then a plaster casting. And so I'm going to kind of show a video for how to you're going to put your mold together, right? Make sure that it is keyed together properly, and that look down into the pour spout and make sure that those seams are, in as much as possible are kind of forced together. Okay, so then you're gonna need your glue gun in your kit. Just be very careful with glue guns. The tip of the glue gun is the heating element. So you really want to make sure that the stand is being used so that you don't lay this down with that on something that could melt. But you're going to need your heating gun, your hot glue gun, and you're going to need it to be plugged in, and it takes a little while for it to heat up enough that it will melt the glue, and you just simply pull the trigger, and just be very careful because this stuff, it's hot, it will burn you. And what we're going to do is, after you get your mold kind of seamed together, we're just going to, almost like when you weld something, you tack weld it, right? We're just going to kind of do a couple of spots. We don't want to go crazy because we want to use this mold a couple of times, but we're going to hot glue a few little spots to hold it together. Okay, so hot glue is fast and it's pretty easy to work with, but just be careful that you don't burn yourself, and you also want to hold the mold together while it's cooling. It takes a little while for it to cool down. Okay, so hopefully your mold is pretty tightly seamed together. After this cools, it's gonna hold it together. Don't hot glue all the way around, because that'll become hard to take off, and it'll actually sort of ruin your mold in the process of trying to separate it. So just tack it a few times. Take the clay that was that you used for the pour spout, right? You could actually just take, like, this was the pour spout of the apple. And, you know, you never throw this clay away. You just recycle it and use it over again. So I'm just rolling some out, and I'm just going to sort of smear it in around the edge of my apple. You don't absolutely have to do this. If your mold is really pretty clean, you might be able to get away with just the little tacks of hot glue. But if you're worried that it might look like it's gonna leak out those seams, right, where the two halves of the mold go together, just take a little bit of this clay and smear it into those, or all around the apple. You know, this mold's been kind of, sometimes it takes a little effort. There's Vaseline in this clay, so it eventually will kind of adhere. You just have to kind of keep smearing it until it sticks. And you're just kind of trying to, you don't want to deform the mold or anything, but you just want to kind of fill that gap all the way around. Doesn't have to look pretty. It just needs to kind of seal that gap. Whoops, that's peeling up. So that's pretty much done. After you do that, you are going to probably want something like a disposable cup or something to put your apple in, to hold it so that the pour spout is upright, and the pour spout is where we're going to be pouring the latex rubber. So we're basically going to just, all we're going to do is we're going to fill the mold all the way up to the top with the rubber, and then we're going to let it sit for a minimum of 15 minutes. You could let it sit longer. You could let it sit for 20 minutes. Maybe, you know, the longer you let it sit, the thicker the thicker the membrane is going to be. So this is called slip casting. This is a technique that is used in ceramics for slip casting into a plaster mold with clay slip. It's also a technique that is used with latex rubber. And basically what's happening is you're pouring this liquid into a plaster mold, and the plaster is very porous, right? That's why I wanted everybody's molds to be dried out. The plaster is like a sponge. It's like a dry sponge. And so when the liquid goes in there and it hits that sponge on the surface, it wicks, it sucks all of the liquid out of the material into the plaster, right? So the rubber actually doesn't really go into the plaster, but the solvent for it, which is mostly, I think, ammonia and water, kind of gets sucked into the plaster, and so it kind of congeals on the surface of the mold. And the longer you leave it there, the more of that kind of wicks into the plaster, and so it builds up a membrane along the surface of the apple. And then you don't dump that out and throw it away. You dump the extra latex back into the same container that it came into, and you can reuse that, okay? So it's a very simple, this is a very simple process. If you're allergic to, oh, and the other thing you can do if you want to experiment, you can take like Liquitex acrylic paint if you want, or any type of any type of kind of you know, acrylic latex paint, and add that to the Liquitex to tint it. So I'm just going to grab another cup here. I don't want to tint my entire batch. I'm going to tint some of it. That way I have some that is still the regular color. So I just have, you know, I mixed some blue and yellow to make green, and I'm just gonna kind of, you know, mix that in. Do not use oil paint, okay? You probably could use gouache, and you don't have to do this step. You can just pour yours in straight latex rubber. It's just that it will come out kind of like that. I don't know what to call it. Kind of like a, I don't know. It's kind of like a industrial, you know, aged amber color. So, and this is, you know, the base of it is kind of like a milky kind of white color. So this is going to be kind of a pastel green. It's not going to be like a super chromatic green. Here, I'm going to actually just try to get a little bit more of that color out of there and mix it together really well. And then I'm good to go. So one thing I actually probably did not give myself enough material to fill my mold. So I'm gonna have to add a little bit more, mix it together. Yeah, maybe it'd be interesting to see what would happen if I didn't actually mix it together all the way. It's okay. I'll just leave it like this. So my apple is being held in place in the cup. And now I'm just simply going to, you don't need any release or anything. I'm just gonna fill up my mold, okay? I want it to go all the way to the top. So, of course, I need to use the rest of my rubber. I just had enough to fill the whole thing. So right now the pour spout is going to be probably no pigment in it. It's okay. This will be an interesting experiment. And it'll probably be kind of a little bit more natural looking, but we'll see. So anyhow, I'm pouring that all the way to the top, and I cannot, it's very important, okay? Do not just wait for this to dry or cure. It will not happen, okay? You have to let this sit for 20 minutes, and then I'm gonna dump this back into the container, back into this container, and put the lid back on it. This material will not set up. It's not like plaster or resins or things where it catalyzes. This air dries. So I'm just letting it kind of, you know, absorb into the outside shell. I'm gonna dump it out and pour it back in here. I'm gonna stop the video very soon here, and then I will come back and show you pouring it out. Now I'm just going to dump the contents of this out back into the container that it came in. It's going to be a little slow at first, and it'll eventually just kind of leak out. So yeah, it's really kind of running out. Now, you have to kind of, you know, don't just turn it upside down and be like, oh, it's not coming out anymore. You really want it to, you know, drain out of there as much as possible. And the rubber is reusable, so to, you know, let it kind of drain out. Sometimes you have to kind of move it around a little to let it run out. And so there's still stuff coming out of it. So now what I would do is put the top on this and take this and turn this upside down in your cup. So if your cup is like mine, it's a little bit too big, you might have to get creative with some way. You don't want to kind of seal it, right? So like that's this is probably okay, because what's going to happen is if I just set this down like this, it would pool into the bottom of the mold, and this would pool into the bottom of the mold, and it would kind of be a big thing of rubber at the bottom of it. So I want the material to drain out of it into the cup, but I also want this to dry out. So after maybe, I don't know, a couple of hours of this draining, I will probably turn this back right side up. I might just let it sit overnight like this, so it sort of, dries out and leaks out as much as possible. I really want that extra material to run out of the mold. And let that dry, and then I'm gonna kind of turn this tomorrow upright, and so that it really has air circulating through it, because it's a closed mold, right? So in order for this to dry out, the air has to go inside of it. So I'm really gonna give it time. All right, so yesterday I poured the mold, and with this casting material, you got to remember that it needs time to dry out. You can't just look at what's going on the top of the pour spout. You got to think about what's going on inside of the mold, because it's kind of like a closed in chamber, and air is not really getting in there. So where the casting's going to be weak is inside of the mold, and you want to make sure to give it time to be able to air out and dry down here in the mold. You could take like a hair dryer to help accelerate that. On campus, when we work on these, we have something called a hot box, and I usually just have people put them in a hot box overnight with it on, and that really helps. I think you're probably going to need to let this sit for in somewhere where it's ventilated. So make sure that when it's drying, that it's like up, so that the air is kind of like circulating in. And I would probably let it sit for maybe 3 days. Okay, so don't try to open the mold after you've gone through the process of filling it, dumping it out, let it drain. I let it drain like this, right, in a cup overnight, so that it kind of all drained out, and then it started to dry and congeal. And then the next day I turned it over and let it dry. I'd let it go for 3 days just to make sure you're good. Okay, now before you're going to open your mold, you're going to probably want to take, if you happen to have any baby powder or any kind of like, powder that you can put in there, and just, you're just going to kind of, whoops, got to open it first. And it's not the neatest process, but I'm just gonna kind of put the powder into my mold. Okay, and then I'm gonna close it off with my hand and kind of really shake it around. Make sure that the entire interior surface gets powdered. You could wear a dust mask, probably wouldn't be a bad idea. And then you can just kind of get the excess powder out. So I would do this process just before you're about to open. I poured this yesterday. It's only been sitting for 24 hours. I'm gonna kind of ask that you let these sit for a couple of more days. Just like let it dry out more, because as it dries, it's gonna get stronger. And I'm worried about this seam. When you go to pull the mold apart, it puts a lot of tension on that seam, and you don't want to tear the rubber.